These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. The year is 737 BCE, and the eastern fringes of the empire are revolting. Now, this shouldn't surprise anyone. The real surprise is that Tiglath-Pileser incorporated that area into the provincial system as if it wouldn't revolt, but sure enough, revolt it has. The reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III are, at this point in his reign, after less than a decade, already rather well set. At the same time, in the latter half of his reign, we see four separate failures that illustrate the operations and beliefs of the Assyrian government perhaps better than their many successes do. The entire final decade of Tiglath-Pileser's reign is generally regarded as notably less effective than the first 8 years, though I really wouldn't go quite so far as that. Rather, we just end up seeing the consequences of his policies as they have more time to play out. Sometimes for better, as with the immense success of his mass deportations policy, and sometimes for the worst, as with the spotty record of establishing new provinces. And that gets us, in fact, to the first failure, and to the year 737 BCE. In Tiglath-Pileser's second year, which was 744, he had conquered the eastern mountains and imposed on them the first of his new model of provinces. He was even able to show off the flexibility of his system, with one province, Parsua, being a proper Assyrian province, but then a sort of Manaean province east of that, which was a new and interesting experiment in hybrid provincial systems. It was, at the time, a showcase of the new Tiglath-Pileser reform system and proof that Assyria was basically destined to take over the entire world. They had, in their army reforms, proven that they could capture basically any territory, and in their provincial system, proven that they could hold and effectively integrate anything their army could capture. The stage was set for the 1,000-year reign of the Assyrian Reich. Except that in the year 737, it appears that every single place in the eastern mountains had completely rebelled, both passively by simply ignoring the demands of the Assyrian heartland, and actively by expelling the Assyrian elements from within those regions. We don't know why or how it all happened. Tiglath-Pileser is a bit too busy to pause and let us know the sociological conditions that led to this unrest, though the king does seem to think that the people of the eastern mountains are just possessed of a rebellious sort of nature, so perhaps they can't really help themselves. But what they can be helped with is some violence. And even if the provincial system has failed over here, the reformed army can still enact sweeping measures of violence upon the heads of the rebellious. It's a bit unfortunate because we know there were once many interesting details about this campaign. We learn in fleeting fragments that there's a mountain called Shiraki, which is both the Assyrian mountain for some reason, and it's also a land of gold, which makes it sound like quite the prize. And we hear in another fragment that there's some random mountain deep in eastern Media that is a fortress belonging to the Babylonians. Now, we'll see in a bit that the Babylonians do not at this time have some great and expansive empire, so the fact that they can maintain what was probably a trade outpost this far distant is quite interesting. We also see that the king is multitasking very heavily, and he's doing a lot of that multitasking with eunuchs. The eunuch governor of Zamua, which is now the easternmost non-rebellious province, is sent on a raiding expedition deep into Media to plunder horses, people, and oxen. And he took 5,000 of them being a mix of horses, people, and oxen, because Tiglath-Pileser doesn't think it's significant to enumerate those categories separately. Oxen, people, and horses are all basically the same thing if you're talking about the eastern mountains. And also, he got so many sheep and goats that he didn't even bother counting them all. At least this part of the Assyrian imperial project is going quite well. The king now has a cadre of eunuch officials that he feels are both competent and trustworthy enough to be entrusted with independent wings of the army. And the logistical system is strong enough to support two independent armies operating in the same, very logistically constrained theater. However, the mere fact that they had to operate here at all is a failure of the provincial system to stabilize the region. Many of the local kings, including people who appear to have just rebelled, appear to have been reconfirmed in their position as tributary kings after the fighting, which is, of course, a significant break from the old policy of anyone who rebels gets their whatever chopped off. But at least the re-established provinces got two new eunuch governors and a bunch of deportees, probably from the west somewhere in those last campaigns. At this time, at least, we won't see an Eastern rebellion for another 22 years, so maybe the provincial system really isn't that bad. Maybe it's just that the Eastern Mountains are just difficult to control and filled with these wandering hooligans who, by their nature, are antithetical to civilization. The next failure of Tiglath-Pileser comes in 735, and it really seems to be the sort of thing that the empire as a whole did quite a good job of learning from, despite what was probably quite a very expensive little expedition. All of Assyria's frontiers are, by 735, decently secure and stable. The logistical system has had a few harvests to really work through all these new provinces, new governors, and this new governing philosophy, and the machine is, as they say, firing on all cylinders. And so the king looks around and recognizes that the only significant threat currently active against him is the kingdom of Urartu to the north. Now, on one hand, this is an absolutely reasonable thing to decide. Urartu is basically at the peak of its power right now, and it's geopolitically aligned against Assyria, even if there hasn't been much significant war between the two lately. Remember that Sarduri had been involved in the Arpad War at the beginning of Tiglath-Pileser's reign, but it seems that the mutual threat of war had been enough to maintain peace. Because that is the other hand here, a war against Urartu is likely to be among the most difficult targets that Assyria could choose. They're not beating up on midgets here, they're contending against a peer adversary. And on paper, the conflict looks pretty rough for both sides. Now, in the propaganda dating to this year and possibly the years around it, when the Arpad War at the beginning of Tiglath-Pileser's reign is recounted, the story starts to feature the perfidy of Sarduri of Urartu much more heavily than the histories written around the time of the actual Arpad War had. Tiglath-Pileser is clearly and self-consciously bigging up the threat of Urartu because part of getting the empire ready for war is swaying the hearts of his own people, or at least the elite, that Urartu really is a genuine enemy and a significant threat. It reminds us that war isn't just something the king gets to decide on his own. It is a collective community decision, bringing on board priests and nobles, and to a certain extent, the people as well. The king is the executive and has wide latitude to make decisions, but there has to be a degree of alignment among the wider ruling class, or at least Tiglath-Pileser feels like he needs to help create that alignment among his ruling class before attacking. It's a reminder that no monarchy is ever truly absolute. And of course, he needs to get his logistics in order. So the year prior, 736, does see a campaign, since of course the Assyrian king needs to kill foreigners literally every year, or the people are going to start worrying that he's a secret atheist. But it's a very limited campaign. It doesn't reach far outside the borders, and because of that, it probably helped the logistical stockpiles grow for the next year's campaign. And he's pushing into the region of Nasapina, which was almost certainly quite strategic. It could have been a feint, making it seem like the Assyrian goal was to cut Urartu off from its western extension, or it could have been an attempt to take control of a significant fortress to prevent attacks on the Assyrian west flank. Either way, it appears to have been a fairly minor campaign all in all, just a bit of preparation before the main event in 735. And we even have a great letter from either a governor or high official. His name is broken, so we only know that he's Ashur-bel something, which honestly could be a lot of people up along the northern border. That's a very common start of a name. But let's read the whole thing, because it not only gives us a sense of the kind of talk that goes on in the lead up to a war, but also a sense of the very concerns of leaders in the provinces. To the king, my lord, your servant Ashur-bel something sends the very best of health to the king, my lord. This month the king, my lord, will go up to Urartu. I'm certain that the gods Ashur and Shamash have already delivered Tushpa, the Urartian capital, into the hands of the king, my lord. Let the king, my lord, launch his military campaign against Urartu, conquer Tushpa, and let the king, my lord, establish his name forever. Hoorah! Note that none of this has happened yet, but appears that at least this guy believed that the plan was to march straight to Tushpa and conquer it without much resistance. Perhaps, after the campaign, the king, my lord, will retrieve and return to my province the ruins of some city we can't read, but which appears to have been captured or destroyed by Urartu during some prior border skirmish. Now, this guy probably wants to make sure that it doesn't get folded into some new province after the conquest is successful, because that would diminish his own region's prestige. And of course, he's so confident in the coming victory that he's already petitioning the king about the allocation of the spoils, even a month before the campaign has actually started. I have received a sealed letter which the king my lord sent me, and I have gone and asked Parne-Alde about the Assyrian messengers who went to Urartu. Now, a bit of the letter is broken at this point, but Ashur-bel something clarifies precisely which 4 messengers went to Urartu, who went first and who went later, and then it continues. The messengers of Urartu came with the Assyrian messengers and met in the house of Yatta, a servant of the king of Shubria. So, something like neutral ground, and they took bread and water until the Urartian messengers returned to Urartu. So it sounds like at least some sort of negotiations were at least attempted, possibly some messages passed back and forth, though we're left in the dark as to what those messages might have been. But this letter from Ashur-bel something closes out with a bit of fun drama around those negotiations. Your servant, it says, Parne-Alde, is plotting. Now, Parne-Alde seems to be Ashur-bel something's assistant of some rank or another. The writer then insists, could it be that I am not telling the truth about the matter of this plot? Let the king, my lord, write to the Shubrian king that he send Parne-Alde and his augur, and let the king, my lord, ask him why Parne-Alde is making the bird omens so favorable. As a side note, the idea that the diviners are manipulating the omens is something I hear insinuated a lot in modern discourse, but it's rare to see stated outright in ancient texts, which usually holds all omens as quite serious matters. But it seems Parne-Alde's omens might not be trustworthy. Perhaps he belongs with Ea-Nasir up in the ranks of untrustworthy Mesopotamians. The governor, with his magnates, has made a sworn deal with the servants of Ashur-bel-Usur, and this vast conspiracy is plotting to kill me. The king, my lord, should know this. Now the letter ends there, but it seems that right as Ashur something is busy handling the logistics for a pre-war peace conference with Urartu, his servant Parni-Alde and the rival magnate Ashur-User are conspiring with each other within the empire to manipulate bird omens and form secret conspiracies among the servants in order to plot the downfall of poor Ashur something while he's busy doing the king's work. Now, whether or not Ashur something is truly in danger, or if he's just being paranoid, or even if he's falsely accusing Parni-Alde and Ashur-User for his own conspiracy, this is the sort of internal politicking that must have been constant, but we rarely get to hear about it. Honestly, think about how much of the historical decision-making of kings was based on the currents of these dramas that never really surface where we can hear about them, and thus we can never truly comprehend the full decision-making process that's ever going on. Anyway, we don't know how this particular drama ends, but Tiglath-Pileser consults the oracles, hopefully some honest ones, near the start of 735, and they confirm that the gods have blessed his expedition against the great enemy and will surely deliver victory into his hands. The army marched north, but not directly to Tushpa. The plan seems to have been to fight 3 battles south of Tushpa first, each time pausing to fight, then plunder and secure the towns in that area, then move on to the next area. Now, we can't specifically identify the locations of most of the towns named because this whole border region is fairly obscure to us now, but the broad outline is that he was generally successful, winning each of these first 3 battles and then sending home modest to high amounts of plunder, managing it all with characteristic Assyrian bureaucratic efficiency. Now, by the time he'd won over these areas, it seems there was no one left to contend with him in the kingdom of Urartu. The king marched the army all the way north to Lake Van without any resistance, until finally he was in sight of the great fortress of Tushpa. Sarduri's army marched out to try and repel the Assyrian army, but for whatever reason, the men and equipment of Urartu simply wasn't up to the task of securing victory on the open field. But Urartu knew better than to commit too heavily to an open field battle, and soon pulled back behind the Cyclopean walls of their mighty fortress. The god Chaldi and the stone walls of their clip-top fortress were the only things protecting the capital city now, and the men of Urartu settled in for a siege. Tiglath-Pileser, meanwhile, had brought an absolutely massive army. We don't have full numbers, but we get the sense that this was a logistically challenging expedition, both because they're going through some rough and hostile terrain, but also because of the sheer scale of the Assyrian army, which is why they had gone so methodically and carefully between last year and the start of this year to ensure that the whole thing would go smoothly. And it seems that the army arrived at the enemy's gates in peak form. They have no shortage of manpower. They have the surrounding area to plunder, and they have all the techniques of siegecraft that had been mastered way back in the Middle Bronze Age, and which had battered so many fortresses down between then and now. And Tiglath-Pileser sent his men against the walls. He may have had rams, he may have had ladders, he may have had digging teams. He doesn't appear to have constructed an earthen ramp, though. The height of the fortress was just too high, and the soil around wasn't really great for digging quite like that. And, it seems actually that probably ladders wouldn't have reached the top of the fortress, because you can only make a ladder so high before it just collapses under its own weight. So, it seems maybe they didn't attempt ladders, or they tried and gave up really fast. And, digging teams, That's not really fit for purpose. They could hardly dig out the foundations of a mountain, as the base of the fortress at Tushpa was not a wall, remember, but a cliff of sheer mountain. And, there's probably a good chance that the rams couldn't have even reached the gates or any of the walls, so treacherous was the approach. And so, they have all this siege stuff, but it looks like the Assyrian army was just kind of left to stand around the outside of one of the most impressive fortresses the world had ever yet seen, and they could do nothing but stare at it. They couldn't even hold on to it as a multi-year siege. For one thing, it's unclear how long Tushpa could have held out for. Was it well fortified as Arpad, which had taken 3 years, or was it even more fortified? For another, the winters of the high Armenian mountains are not something the Assyrian armies are really prepared for. And for a third, Tiglath-Pileser was logistically much further away from his homeland than he had been during his campaigns in Syria. There wasn't as much chance for him to be reliably resupplied, or for him to run the entire empire from the gates of Tushpa while waiting for it to fall. And so he spent maybe a month or two standing around the outside of Tushpa, growing increasingly frustrated, at which point he ordered a big old stela to be carved outside of the city, probably a quite large one, befitting his ego and dignity. And then they carved that Tiglath-Pileser had attacked the city of Tushpa and had, claimed some of it with the power of the god Asher. And the cope that his propagandists invented here is that he had forced Sarduri to remain in Tushpa like a bird in a cage, thus demonstrating his grand superiority. But then, as the Assyrian army gave up and withdrew, the stela was torn down by the Urartians. The Assyrian army had grabbed some plunder on their way to the shores of Lake Van, but they had been soundly defeated, not even by an enemy army, but by the unconquerable walls of an enemy structure. As thorough and powerful as the army's reorganization had been, it had now been defeated twice in highly important sieges. First at Arpad, where they'd been forced to wait 3 years to starve out the enemy, and second at Tushpa, where they just simply had to return home for lack of power to move forward. For all that Tiglath-Pileser seems to have played it off as not much of a problem, it was a genuine failure of the army and a weakness of his reforms. Now, did Tiglath-Pileser solve this weakness? I don't know. We can't really say one way or the other. He wouldn't again attempt a siege battle of quite such daunting scale ever again. But it seems clear that the Empire's top military minds were turning the problem over in their heads for quite a while after that. 20 years later, Sargon II will march on Tushpa and actually breach the citadel. So this is one of those learning experiences coming out of failure. It doesn't make Tiglath-Pileser look any better. Did he not know how strong Tushpa was, or did he not realize that his army wasn't powerful enough to breach it? Either way, you've got a failure of information, which is another matter that Sargon II is going to make big strides on. But that's all for later. We don't hear about any immediate negative consequences from this loss. Surely it helps that the king is sitting on a bunch of victories at this point, and I don't think anyone in the ancient world genuinely expected to never lose. At the same time, it's deeply unclear just how far word might have spread about this loss. While certainly the nobility in the heartland needed to be placated and convinced that it wasn't really, all that bad of a loss, but what about a minor scribe in the Khabar region? Would he have known about any of it? What about the western kings, like, say, Menahem of Israel, Rahianu of Damascus, or Hiram II of Tyre? Was their anti-Assyrian coalition empowered by this news, or Was it just completely ignorant of it? The strong and firm answer is, we don't know. But because they did become active against the empire, Tiglath-Pileser was able to fairly quickly restore his invincible image with 3 quite active years against Israel and the Levant. But we're going to save the Israel-Damascus-Phoenicia narrative for next episode because it cuts through 3 Assyrian reigns, and also because today we're talking about failure. So we march forward to 731. Now, does Tiglath-Pileser know that he's looking at his final years at this point? We never hear any indications of royal mortality unless the circumstances are particularly notable, but as he surveys his empire, he must be decently pleased with himself. Things are finally quiet to the east and the west in 731, and his nemesis, King Sargon II, has just died up in Urartu, and Tiglath-Pileser does not know yet that his successor, Rusa, is going to be even more of an agitator. But then he looks down south, and he probably feels the awkward pit in his stomach that you feel when you know there's a problem, but you don't know how to properly solve it. Because, of course, the problem in Babylon is fundamentally that the Assyrian kings don't want to destroy Babylon. Now, they're happy to destroy pretty much any other city outside their borders, but Babylon is in the uncomfortable position of being within the Assyrian, or really Mesopotamian, cultural sphere without being within the Assyrian political sphere. And it's never really wanted to join up with the Assyrian imperial project. Indeed, Babylon has its own nascent imperial project in the supremacist Marduk cult. Marduk, of course, can't be formally celebrated in Ashur very easily because Ashur and Marduk both claim a lot of the same supremacies over the divine world. But Babylonian cultural influences and the cult of Marduk directly are so popular within the Assyrian heartland that people are naming their children after the god Nabu, son of Marduk, all over the place, because that's a little bit more acceptable than just naming your child Marduk instead of Ashur himself. Now, in a way, this is humanizing and heartwarming. It's a big part of the reason why Babylonian culture was able to continue even when Babylonian political power was on the wane, and why the lineage of scientific and cultural progress was able to continue through 3,000 plus years of Mesopotamian history. And it's nice to see that the Assyrians were fully realized humans with something other than malice in their heart for everyone who didn't directly benefit them. But at the same time, this is kind of a trouble, because Assyria was, for all that this episode's been about failures, Assyria was very, very good at destroying cities and decimating the countryside. But that wasn't the toolkit really needed down south. You see, what had happened is that while Tiglath-Pileser had been finishing up the campaign against Damascus, his friend down in Babylon, King Nabu-Nadnezeri, was killed by a rebellion and replaced by one of the military officers formerly subordinate to him. After a month and 2 days, that rebel king was in turn killed by a Chaldean warlord, Nabu-Muken-Zeri, of the Bit Amukani Chaldeans. Now, this rebellion was an indication that the house of Nabonassar had failed to properly establish the kingdom of Babylon within its own borders. A state, then as now, is fundamentally defined by its monopoly on the use of force within its own territory, and the Babylonian king was unable to establish himself as even the most powerful army within Babylonian territory, not to mention their neighbors, and was just being overwhelmed by multiple groups of both Arameans and Chaldeans. But this is also a failure for Tiglath-Pileser. Remember that Assyria had intervened extensively in Babylonia during his early reign, all in an attempt to stabilize the proper dynasty of Nabonassar and have a nice, civilized southern neighbor rather than a bunch of anarchic tribes that had learned to eat cities. But the diplomatic dance of Assyria wanting to respect the throne of Babylon, at least within its own territory, had led to chronic undercommitment of resources and an inability to properly clear the barbarians out of what had long been civilized lands. For a rather striking modern parallel, think about the Mexican drug cartels. Mexico doesn't have the ability to get rid of them, and America doesn't want to show up the Mexicans so severely as a full-on invasion for a variety of political, economic, and cultural reasons. And so the problem persists until Babylon falls to the Chaldeans, which was not the outcome Tiglath-Pileser had been looking for. Fortunately, the very instability of the Chaldeans proved to be their undoing, at least in this final campaign of Tiglath-Pileser. In Babylon's weakness, the Chaldeans had shifted from being primarily nomadic to primarily settled, and set up essentially three parallel states within Babylonia. Again, much like the Mexican cartels, it's interesting how the parallels run here. To the north was Bit Dakuri, in the south was Bit Yakin, and in the middle was Bit Amukani, who now held the Babylonian throne. And in the swamps on the Gulf Coast was Bit Sha'ali. Now, there were some other minor tribes as well, but these are the only ones that I want to keep track of their names. Don't even worry about the rest. It's just a bunch of names. Their control over territory, the Chaldean control over Babylonian territory, is so absolute that towns in their regions typically pay tribute to the Chaldean leader, and international trade coming through passes only with their say-so. And it's not clear that much of it at all makes it ultimately to the palace of Babylon at this point. And so Tiglath-Pileser marches the army down because that is the one and only solution to all Assyrian problems. The army marches in multiple columns, and I mean multiple, like spread out hundreds of miles apart. And Tiglath-Pileser makes extensive use of his subordinates to handle the various tasks involved here. The army itself marches in like a bird trap, is what the histories say, and he's going around in a great circle to the edges of Babylonia, either making deals with or destroying the various tribes he encountered. Since the Bit Amukani had taken the throne of Babylon, and thus taken the preeminent position among the Chaldean tribes, and the Arameans appear to have been largely marginalized in all of this, the Bit Yakin and Bit Dakari tribes appear to have been open to at least a certain degree of cooperation with the Assyrians in taking down, very specifically, the Bit Amukani tribe. Meanwhile, Assyria sought support from the Babylonian people themselves, sending a diplomatic persuasion delegation to the city. However, when this delegation arrived, the people of Babylon at first refused to believe that they were actually there from the Assyrian government to help the Babylonian people. They appear to have had suspected some sort of trap, and began to insist that they would not open any gates for any Assyrians until the king arrived. Somewhere in all of this, it appears that promises were made that Tiglath-Pileser would in fact come down to Babylon and ride in upon a white donkey. Though what exactly the people of Babylon were expecting in all that is not clear. We have an undated letter that appears to be from this expedition within Babylon that reads, "Concerning what the king wrote to me, he told me to write the names of all the citizens of Babylon who have come to my side in a letter and send it to me." And this was presumably so that Tiglath-Pileser could see how well his missionary and infiltration effort was going. But the letter simply concludes with, "Mini mini la ilika," no one has come. And so, having encircled the central Chaldean tribe and their hostage city of Babylon, Tiglath-Pileser's various army groups catch Nabu-Mukhenzeri in his Chaldean capital fortress of Shapia, where they put him to siege. However, they seem unable to take the town of Shapia, and then they just sort of give up on trying when the Chaldean king flees from that siege to the city of Babylon. So the next year, Tiglath-Pileser sets a very careful approach to the city of Babylon itself. Meanwhile, as he's setting this all up, another army group goes down into the swamps to fight the southern Chaldean tribe of Bit Sha'ali, and they do eventually report some measure of victory, but the fighting seems to have been really rough down in the swamps, as it always seems to be. Anyway, as the main army very carefully approaches Babylon, conditions both within and without the city compel the Chaldean Nabu-Mukhenzeri to again flee to Shapia, which was then enthusiastically besieged, but again not taken, and Nabu-Mukhenzeri escapes again back to Babylon. In 729, this Looney Tunes chase is cut short, as the Assyrian army surgically cuts its way through the gate of Babylon. However, the description of the entry into Babylon is very different from other city conquests. It seems violence was kept to a minimum and plunder not tolerated. Nabu-Mukhenzeri was surrounded in his palace and then extracted for an execution. At this point, Tiglath-Pileser decides that no Babylonian king has quite the balls to properly enforce order in Babylonia, and so he crowns himself as Pul, king of Babylon. Now, note the massive significance of that. He never crowned himself as king of Arpad or Damascus when he took those places. These were just entered in as new provinces. The Babylonian state is kept as its own corporate entity here, one that just happens to share a head with the Assyrian state. Now, this happens a lot in medieval European history, but I'm not sure I can think of too many places in Mesopotamian history where we see it. Now, he holds the throne name in Babylon of Pulu, though, like I said a few episodes back, we have no real idea where this name comes from or what it means. Now, for the last 2 years of Pulu's life, he is the king of 2 independent nations, Assyria and Babylon, but much of his attention is focused on securing the south while the north holds steady. Enforcing his order against the many Chaldean and Aramean tribes is a part of that, as is a very poorly preserved record of Elamite movements into Babylonia. Now, we haven't heard a lot from the Elamites in a long time. They've been sitting down in southwest Iran this whole time, having their own independent parallel history. But it seems that right about now, they've gotten their act together enough to start again causing trouble in Mesopotamia. And these are some of the first hints of the danger that we'll be seeing from them. But this game of 2 thrones doesn't last very long, and in 727, Tigalth-Pileser, king of Assyria, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, called Pulu or Pul by the people of the world, passes away from unknown causes, but probably naturally. He's succeeded by his son, Shalmaneser V, whose record will be decidedly mixed, and I did promise 4 failures, but believe me, the 4th is Shalmaneser V, and we're going to see that in detail soon enough. But next time, we're going to look at the 3 kings who destroyed Israel, because that's a narrative that, properly speaking, runs from 734 until about 720, and will make the most sense if told all at once. And as a backdrop of all of that, we're going to see the quite murky circumstances of the power transition into Sargon II, who's probably the most famous king in all of Assyrian history, and with very good reason. So join us next time for the Syro-Ephraimite War, for a bunch of court drama, and a second battle of Karkar, far less famous than the first. If you've been enjoying this show, please, please, please like and subscribe and comment and share and do all the social media things, because it really, really helps to grow the show. Thank you for listening.